So my name is Tim Rogers. I'm the Village of New Paltz mayor, and I've created a list of 10 topics within 4 categories that highlight why it would make a great deal of sense to end up with one governmental board instead of the 2 boards that we've had since 1887. So what's interesting about New Paltz's history is that our town was founded in 1678, and you can actually see that here on the village banner. But what's important is that's actually a little bit confusing, is that the village of New Paltz was incorporated in 1887. And we have to think, and I think remind ourselves, why were we originally incorporated? We were originally incorporated because we had a dense downtown with wood frame buildings, and we wanted to protect them from the risk of fire. So what was done was we invested in a series of fire hydrants to empower and protect the downtown. And how do you pay for fire hydrants? You pay for fire hydrants by selling municipal water to the properties downtown. So now in New Paltz, we have fire hydrants that are throughout the village, throughout the town. The original premise as to why this village was originally incorporated no longer exists. So what we're left with is basically a collection of complicated funding formulas that are used to figure out how we share revenues between the town and the village. Okay, we're talking about village and town finances. We're using this prop here, the decades-old Village of New Paltz safe that our treasurer is the only one who has access to it, and the clerk's office staff. But in terms of finances, what's interesting when you go and look back into the documentation when individuals or groups like the League of Women Voters were highlighting why it would make sense to move to 1 board instead of 2, is there's this phrase, funding formulas. And I would wholeheartedly agree that I spend, as mayor, entirely too much unnecessary time simply trying to manage our finances in relation to revenues that the town of New Paltz is securing. So for instance, you have mortgage recording tax, where 75% of it goes to the town outside the village, and 25%, and this is approximate, based on assessed values, would be revenue that would be due from mortgage recording tax goes to the town's general fund, or to the village's general fund, 25%. But what's curious about mortgage recording tax as an example is that you could have all of the transactions that generate mortgage recording tax occur in the town outside the village. But then the village would still be eligible for 25% of that revenue. So that's an example of something that is not necessarily equitable, does not necessarily make sense, but we're stuck with this curious formula that we then have to check and triple check, as I did a couple of years ago, and identified that the formula is actually being not followed correctly, and we had to involve the county comptroller's office to make sure that it was being handled correctly. It was actually in the favor of the town, and I was told incorrectly that the village was due money, and I knew that that was wrong, and my goal with everything that we work on is that it has to be defensible, it has to make sense. So even when I was told by officials who did an initial review up at the county that it was to the village's benefit, back of the envelope, I knew that was wrong. And I cannot sleep at night knowing that calculations are wrong or that my neighbors would be impacted negatively. So that is a simple example of a funding formula that we're responsible for managing and keeping track of that really serves no one at all, except it allows for this extra bureaucratic layer of government to be propped up. My second example relates to how we collect sales tax from cannabis. So in New York State, when you have a municipality that's within a town, and if it's a simple example like ours, which is a relatively simple example because in Nassau County you can have multiple villages in a town, But in our example, if you have a dispensary in your village, half of that sales tax revenue from cannabis would go to, or the local share, half of its share would go to the village and the other half would go to the town outside the village. Unlike mortgage recording tax, where when there's mortgage recording tax due to our community, 75% of it goes to the town outside the village and 25% of it goes to the village. But then my third example for a complicated funding formula that we have to keep track of has to do with sales tax. So in Ulster County, our sales tax is distributed based on the assessed value of a community. So you could have a community like New Paltz, where we actually have an assessed value that's not a whole lot greater than the town of Olive. And I think that comes as a surprise to many people. It definitely came as a surprise to me. So the town of Olive is receiving a similar amount of sales tax if you compare it to the entire town of New Paltz, both village and town. And that's a function of the way our county shares sales tax. They share sales tax based on assessed value. In New York State, a county could choose to share sales tax based on population, but that is not how our county government currently functions. So what that means is the village of New Paltz and definitely the town of New Paltz get a curiously small percentage. We know how vibrant our community is. I've been able to secure records in terms of sales tax revenue by zip code from the New York State Department of Finance, and we're receiving a proportionately very low share compared to our consideration. And that's a function of, you know, a tax-exempt property like the college is not included when sales tax is distributed. So the village is receiving an oddly small share of sales tax, but meanwhile we know that there's tons of bodies on that tax-exempt college property, both staff and professors and students, who are contributing to the generation of sales tax, but then it's not trickling back down to our community. The fourth reason that we would highlight why funding formulas can be unnecessarily complicated and just create a layer of bureaucracy would have to do with pilot revenue, and then when a town tax levy is X and a village tax levy is Y, and that proportional relationship changes over time, and therefore the revenue to the town and the village change over time. So an example would be Woodland Pond's pilot. So as the village is proactively and carefully trying to make sure that we're not increasing tax rates, then when the pilot revenue for instance, Woodland Pond is made available, there's then a formula in terms of how it's distributed, and it's based on the tax levy in the town outside the village and the tax levy in the village itself. So when those tax levies are changing in a direction that's disproportionate with where they were when the agreement was first signed, the village is actually getting a smaller share of that revenue. So these are formulas that we're supposed to follow and carefully follow, and I don't think we are serving anyone by having our treasurer's office and our mayor, and then also the town comptroller, and then the folks responsible for finances in the town, having to perform these arithmetic gymnastics just to maintain another level of board. And I think what's super fascinating about our opportunity to end up with one board is that we are not in a complicated situation, which would be what a village in Long Island, for instance, would have to endure. A village in Long Island, let's say Nassau County, what's curious about Nassau County is there are 2 cities, 3 towns, 63 villages, and 63 unincorporated hamlets. In Ulster County, where we live, we're one of 3 villages. There are 20 towns and 1 city. The 5th reason to take a closer look at a single government can be illustrated with a simple example. The 5th reason regarding finances has to do with streetlights and how they're paid for and who pays for them. If you are a village resident, you are paying for streetlights in the village. However, if you are a village resident, you are also paying into the town's A fund, so you're also paying a proportional share of the cost of streetlights in the town outside the village. That is not the way that should be done. If you were actually going to follow a funding formula correctly, those streetlights should be paid for exclusively in the town's B fund by town outside the village taxpayers. So in New Paltz, number 6 on our list in terms of reasons. I'll give you a little background. So in New Paltz, historically, we've sourced 60% of our drinking water from water that we purchased from the New York City DEP's Catskill Aqueduct. The other 40% is sourced from 4 surface water reservoirs that are up here off of Mountain Rest Road. So what we did to augment how much water we buy from the New York City DEP is that we drilled 4 groundwater wells that will help us source more local water. The municipal water that New Paltz relies upon is exclusively sourced by the village. There are no town water sources. So what that means is if you are in a town water district, you're buying water at a different rate from the village. Under consolidation, the cost of water for town districts would actually go down. So that would be the most equitable way to move forward in terms of like assuming that the revenues that we're receiving now would remain the same. That's how you would structure that relationship. Having one board would make sense because both the town and the village need licensed operators. The town has a sewer responsibility with sewer district number 6. Obviously the village has multiple responsibilities that you need an operator for, but it's an example of we should have one entity that we contract with. So the 8th reason and advantage for New Paltz, if we were to move to a single governmental entity, would be really regarding water and sewer metering. We have 2 different offices, a town office and a village office, that sends out bills and notices, and you need a specialty type of software to create those bills and notices. We have redundant efforts. The same thing with metering in general. The village at this point is now doing the metering for the town and the village because we've moved to a more advanced type of meter. But the reconciliation between village water department and town water districts is just again like a funding formula calculation and complication that I think is unnecessary and does not serve the broader community or the water users. Also under capital facilities and maintenance is how we have historically paid for capital projects at Moriello Pool Park. Several administrations ago, an intermunicipal agreement, again, that IMA initialism was created, and it said that operations would be paid for 100% by the town's A fund. However, capital projects at Moriello Pool Park would be split 50-50. So again, a weird funding formula that we have to keep track of. I don't know that it serves anyone, but it's definitely something that has to be reviewed, and then each time there's a proposed improvement at Moriello Pool park, it has to be reviewed by staff in the town and the village, and also most likely it will involve, attorney review as well. So the 10th reason would involve paving, plowing, and buildings and grounds. The 10th reason would include having a single team which could plan and get individual staff on the same page, versus having some staff are employed by the village, some staff being employed by the town to work towards getting those important essential services handled. Regarding government administration, like the building department, I'm going to highlight number 11 on our list. Having two building departments where the community isn't sure which building department would be responsible for the review of their proposed project. It's the same thing with clerk's office. You can have individuals in our community who may need the town clerk or the village clerk and they're not sure. So on a daily basis, I know from our staff that they are contacted by individuals who are looking for assistance from the clerk's office, and maybe sometimes they need the village clerk and sometimes they need the town clerk, but we're often sending people on goose chases because it's pretty unintuitive unless this is your day-to-day. The other advantage regarding number 11 and general administration or governmental administration is that having one clerk, a clerk is a legal responsibility. There are very specific things that clerks have to perform. So there is, by default, a redundancy having two clerks. I would imagine you can take the staff who are in both of these offices and find plenty of work for everyone in a single government. But for instance, records management is an enormous time-consuming responsibility that is the responsibility of the clerk's office. So having records management for a single governmental entity makes more sense than having a records management effort for two governmental entities. So the 12th reason why our community should take a harder look at ending up with a single board has to do with intermunicipal agreements, and there are several examples that we could cite. Again, administrative, bureaucratic, unnecessarily complicated layers of government is, so we have beautiful flowers that we generally get at a very significant discount from Walkill View Farms, and sometimes they even donate them. These flowers are truly amazing. Our community really appreciates them. They get hung on the poles on our main street. So they need to be watered. These flowers will die if they're not watered at least 5 times a week. So which staff are doing it, town or village? Some years town staff have done it, some years village staff have done it. Where is the water being sourced from? If it's a gator, that is the vehicle that's bringing the water around, and it's a piece of equipment that's owned by the village, but a town staff is driving the gator, you actually have to paper that arrangement with a legal intermunicipal agreement. So I struggle when I provide examples like that as, here's why we should end up with one board. And people are like, oh, you want to have one board so it'll help with the flowers on Main Street. No, that is one example of many. It's an example of a situation where we don't need to have this complicated layer of government simply to make sure that the beautiful flowers are enjoyed. The intermunicipal agreement, it's like we have to paper these relationships and these agreements. The same thing with like Water District number 5 that has been proposed for Plains Road. This is a town project. So the idea that we're like papering deals between the town and the village, papering curiously unnecessarily complicated intermunicipal agreements, well, like, then how does the town get compensated for the water that's sourced from Plains Road? Like, none of this stuff will need to exist when you have one system where it's one conveyance system that uses one water source. Our water filtration all comes from the plant up on Mountain Rest Road. The first thing about a town and village is that a village cannot own property if it's not contiguous with the rest of the village. So the village is responsible for running the water plant. The wrinkle here is that our water plant property, where we have surface water, ponds and groundwater wells and a $5.5 million filtration plant, is it's not contiguous with the village. So what's going on, and this has gone on for a few decades at this point, is that the village is technically leasing this property from the town of New Paltz. So again, like a layer of weird bureaucracy just to keep this reality of two boards propped up. So the other interesting thing about this property is that it's also used by our town-wide police department and uses it as a shooting range, and it makes a good deal of sense. It's a protected area. There's no neighbors that are very nearby, and it's a good place for the police to make sure that their firearms are working correctly and they know how to use them.
What do we got here?
We have a lot of historical documentation related to our community's interest, where dissolution, consolidation, coterminus have all been discussed and considered for the last 75 years. Right, in the historical collection in the Elting Memorial Library, there's a very thick binder with a lot of this same information, but it's basically news articles and resolutions and planning reports that various attorneys and elected officials and consultants have prepared over the years. I think what's super interesting is that you can find years and years and years of newspaper articles on this topic. In New Paltz, the only time it's been voted on was in 1966 and in 1993, where the village residents were voting on whether or not to dissolve the village. Each time those referendums failed and village voters chose not to dissolve the village. I think what's super fascinating about it is a big champion for consolidation or ending up with one board has been the League of Women Voters of New Paltz. So here there's their 1972 report.
And in closing, I think what's interesting and important about this opportunity that we should be taking a closer look at is that we could truly move to a single, more efficient form of government like the League of Women Voters were hoping that we would move to back in the 60s and 70s. It would make a great deal of sense just in terms of transparency and accountability and just functionality. And if anyone ever has any questions whatsoever, feel free to, talk about it on social media, because, social media is a great way to get ideas out and about and get people mindful of, some of the things that the local government is working on. But also do not hesitate to, grab me, give me a call, ask for a meeting. This work is interesting and fun, and, it's lots of puzzles that we get to work on. So it's, lots of questions, plenty of it's unintuitive, so don't hesitate if you have any questions whatsoever.